Hello, hello, hello. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Folks are going to continue to join as this webinar goes live. So first off, I am not the person you're here to see. I am just the host. My name is Tom Blute with Interabang Books, and we have the honor and the privilege of hosting these phenomenal authors for an incredible event tonight. For those of you who are just joining us, this is Tech in Sci-Fi with Cory Doctorow in conversation with Annalee Newitz and Ken Liu. Folks, you should see Attack Surface. This is the book that we are so excited about tonight. Cory's new book. For those of you who enjoyed Little Brother and Homeland, let me tell you, this is an exciting debut, but not a debut, I should say, an exciting addition to the lineage of the books. I'm a huge fan myself, so excuse me while I geek out a little bit. This has been just incredible. We've got some great authors here tonight talking about tech and sci-fi. Real quickly, for those of you who are familiar with our bookstore, we've finished with our renovations. We're open. This is actually our 1-year anniversary since a tornado came through and wiped out our store. So we're so excited to celebrate that anniversary with this event. I promise you it has nothing to do with wrath and destruction on a godlike level. So that's not going on here. Anyway, I've talked for far, far too long, but thank you all so much for joining us. And now I'm going to turn it over to our incredible author of the evening, at least the keynote author, Cory Doctorow. Cory, please take it away, sir.
Thank you, Tom, and congratulations to Interabang. As a recovering bookseller, I'm always delighted to hear about stores that are thriving and renovating and doing well in the world. So mazel tov to you, and greetings to everyone joining us tonight. I have two very good guests for tonight's event. Tonight's event, in case you are confused, is the Tech and Sci-Fi event. It's part of an 8-lecture series in which distinguished guests who understand stuff really well join me to talk about various themes that crop up in the book Attack Surface and in its prequels, Little Brother and Homeland. And the guests tonight are Annalee Newitz, who's a science journalist and author of The Future of Another Timeline, as well as a forthcoming novel called The Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age. Also joining me tonight is Ken Liu, the author of The Grace of Kings and the Paper Menagerie, who is a lawyer and a programmer, and so uniquely suited to talk about the themes in this book. In fact, you could hardly ask for two better guests to talk about the themes in this book, not least because Ken, on the one hand, is a programmer who used to do patent litigation support and understands law and cyber law, and Annalee is a technologist and tech activist and tech and science writer who at one point had my old office at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So we are definitely very well met here tonight. So the format of these things is that I read briefly from Attack Surface, and then I have some questions to kick us off. And then we will have a conversation that'll run to about 1:45. And then you in the audience will, by that point, have populated the Q&A tab down there with some good questions. And we will answer your questions as best as we can until the hour or so. And then we will leave you to probably join another Zoom conference, because if there's one thing I like to do at the end of the day, it's log into as many optional Zoom conferences as possible. And I'm sure you feel the same. So I'm going to read to you a brief technical discursion from Attack Surface. And if you know Little Brother and Homeland, you know that its motif is the technical discursion. The protagonist of this book is a woman named Masha Maximov, who's a surveillance contractor turned surveillance mercenary turned refusenik, someone who's trying to reckon with the moral legacy of the work she's done, helping dictators smash pro-democracy movements, helping the US Army hunt insurgents in Iraq, helping the DHS hunt terrorists in America, and what it means that now the cyber weapons that she spent her career developing have been turned loose on her childhood best friend in Oakland, who has grown up to become a Black Lives Matter activist who's being targeted by the same cyber mercenaries that she used to work for. And she is addressing the fact that the discovery of her friend's targeting with those cyber weapons. And she says, cryptography works. If a programmer does her job right and doesn't make mistakes, the messages that her program scrambles will resist brute force attacks until the end of time and space. When a government wants to access someone's secrets, they need to find a way to get at them without directly attacking the crypto. I mean, why burn resources and time attacking the part of the lock mathematically proven to be secure? There are so many other angles that a government can use. Like, they could send someone to your house and put up a tiny camera the size of a pinhead in a position that lets them see your screen. Or they could wait until you leave your laptop in a hotel room and send someone to break the inevitably shitty hotel room door locks and take over your computer with bad USB or by sticking a hardware keylogger in it or some other method. But physical intrusion is so pre-digital, it lacks the elegance of a software-based attack. Which brings us back to this idea that security is a process and not a product. For software to be secure, it has to have a way to receive updates from the people who made it, because they're always finding bugs and will always find bugs, and so security is a process and not a product. So what about forcing a company to update its software that's something that introduces a bug rather than fixing one? Companies are not happy about doing this, but maybe you can bribe a low-level employee, or you can get your attorney general to threaten to put the CEO in jail unless he orders a flunky to write some spyware and ship it to your targets in the guise of a security update. As a bonus, paranoid people worried about government surveillance are also the people who are most diligent about applying their security updates. This is where binary transparency comes in. Even if a company is willing to push spyware disguised as security, they probably don't want to send it to all their users, not least because the wider that these things are spread, the more likely it is that someone will spot the switcheroo and blow the whistle. The best way is to ship a targeted backdoor and target it to a user, a city, a region, possibly a country, but ideally not to everyone, because everyone includes bored, obsessive grad students who decompile every update from every company looking for a thesis subject. Which means that one way to spot a backdoor in your security update is to compare the update that you receive with all the updates that everyone else receives. That's binary transparency. Programs ship with binary transparency modules that automatically take a fingerprint of every update they receive and send that to one or more transparency servers, possibly with a fingerprint of the program before and after the update's installation. Sometimes there are different versions of the program based on language, so the English patch might not be the same as the Chinese patch because their error messages are in different languages. But when two Chinese users get two different patches, something might be going on. Binary transparency is elegant and cool. It gets turned on before the computer is deputized to spy on its user, which means that it's already in place when the G-man shows up at your door. If they force you to push out a backdoor, binary transparency will reveal it. If they force you to push out an update for everyone that turns off binary transparency, everyone will notice and the binary targets will stop updating. This means that a rational government agency won't even bother to ask for backdoors because they'll never work. Because binary transparency takes backdoors off the table, it takes asking for backdoors off the table too. And that's the theory. But binary transparency is one of those things that's exciting in theory and really messy in practice. First of all, nearly every binary transparency alert is a false alarm. Maybe the company sends different updates to different customers as a way of live testing an experimental feature. Or the update or its fingerprint gets changed in some minor way by an ISP that's doing deep packet inspection or some other stupid thing. Neither of these things happen very often, but they both happen a lot more often than binary transparency catching a real backdoor, in part because companies known to have binary transparency turned on, understandably, don't get as many backdoor demands from spies. So almost no one knows what binary transparency is, and even if you do, chances are all that you know about it is that it's a thing that you can safely ignore, because it only ever throws false alarms. Which wouldn't be so bad if government agencies were rational, but spies are by definition total weirdos. Think for a second about the kid you knew growing up who always wanted to be a spy someday. The combination of grandiosity, authoritarianism, and paranoia. In the 1960s, the CIA tried surgically implanting cats with listening devices, and then training them to spy on America's enemies. This is real. Google acoustic kitty. Think about this for a second. Not only did the CIA think veterinarians who insisted that you couldn't implant huge battery-operated recording devices in live cats were just not trying hard enough, they also thought that you could train cats. Because when you give paranoid, grandiose authoritarians an unlimited budget and no oversight, things get fucked up. All right, that's the reading. And it was the most techno-heavy of all the readings that I could find for tonight, because I really wanted to prime us for this discussion. So Annalee, I wanted to start with you. You've got so many hats you wear, as does Ken. You're a writer, you're a critic, you're a science and tech writer. what are the tech stories that stand out for you as doing something amazing and interesting and chewy with tech? And what are the ones that set your teeth on edge?
Wow, that's a good question. I was just Googling acoustic kitty. So, let me talk about fiction instead of nonfiction for a minute here.
Sure.
I think that the stories that I find most interesting these days are ones that explore the ways that technology is going to eventually merge in some way with biology or the environment, especially the environment, because there are so many people now who are looking at ways that we can remediate climate change by either just measuring environmental changes using sensors or other means, or in fact, figuring out ways to use technology in sort of biomedical contexts. And I think, again, of course, we're in an era where a ton of money is being poured into a lot of these biomedical technologies. Not a lot's being poured currently into kind of the environmental remediation, although we're seeing a lot of ramping up on that too. So I get really excited when I see stuff like Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy, which is an oldie but goodie and really kind of set the tone for a lot of this kind of environmental exploration. How do you have kind of an entire environment that is also technological? I got really excited about 1 billion years ago when I first read Paolo Bacigalupi, because he talked a lot about calories when he talked about his technologies. And I loved that idea of sort of measuring energy in calories and thinking about technology in that kind of context. What I'm really tired of is science fiction or even just sort of speculative analysis of the future that assumes we will invent some kind of supercomputer that will be really, really smart and solve all our problems for us. And this is, something that, you and I have talked about a lot, Cory, and this sort of rapture of the nerds idea. It's boiling hot. That idea is still pervasive, especially right now in Silicon Valley. And I see a lot of it spilling over into really dangerous rhetoric about how we're all going to be saved by a vaccine. Which, of course, we will need a vaccine to mitigate all the problems that we're dealing with this pandemic and pandemics to come. But at the same time, it doesn't allow us to think in a nuanced way about how vaccines work, because vaccines are not just a magical technology, they are a social technology, and they require, of course, government infrastructures for distribution, and they require, sensitivity to economic issues and who's can pay for these kinds of things. So I think that's that kind of technology thinking just bugs me, because it's never that kind of thinking never pays attention to the context in which the technology is being deployed, right? Like there's just no economy, there's no politics. It's just like us and our machines, just like being injected with all the good stuff, So I'm going to be healthy, I'm going to be a super being, no problem. So those are my happy places and my dark places.
I love that answer, and particularly this idea that you have people who, when they're confronted with a problem that has a qualitative and a quantitative dimension, but only know how to do work on the quantitative part, assume they can safely dispose of the qualitative part, and it will all be fine. Yeah,
all problems are reducible to optimization problems. You just have to find the parameter to optimize for. That's
exactly.
The thinking.
Yeah, and that's why I like sort of this messy thinking around like how is our technology kind of part of the environment, because I think that requires us to really always be thinking about externalities and kind of remembering the social dimensions as well.
That's great. It reminds me of the copyright wars and people saying, programmers saying, well, why can't you just tell me how many seconds is a fair use? And saying, well, because a judge has to decide whether it's parody. And they say, well, we don't know how to make a judge in Silicon. And we say, you're right. And they say, great, how many seconds is fair use? So,
what is the smallest possible unit of parody?
Tiny Tim, surely. Ken,
Carrot Top.
Two Carrot Tops.
in the run up to this, you know, we had a little correspondence, and you sent me a really spectacular essay about tech and storytelling and sustainability. And I spent a bunch of time trying to craft a question that would allow you to enumerate its thesis. And I realized that the most elegant and simple version of that was, could you tell us the thesis of this spectacular essay of yours?
Sure, thank you. So I've been doing a lot of thinking as a result of the pandemic on what is it that storytellers are doing, and how can we play a role in the future of our society. And you know, in one way, storytellers really have nothing useful to add, because, you know, we don't invent technology, we don't invent vaccines, we don't really do anything. So, you know, and we don't contribute very much to the economy. We're sort of useless. But, you know, I thought about it and I was like, actually, wait a minute, that's not really quite right. Technology itself is about storytelling. And it turns out that my deep interest as a technologist and as a writer has always been in the ways in which stories are about values, and how the story of technology leads to specific values being enshrined. So I'll give you an example, right? One of the ways in which I think stories about technology frustrating me is the way we talk about big tech and about people who do technology and about Silicon Valley. A very common storyline is companies and corporations are obsessed with profits, and that's why technology is so bad. It's all profit driven. You know, the root of the problem is capitalism. Not to say that that story makes no sense, but it's very reductive, and it doesn't actually account for something much more important, which is if you know anything about the people who work in technology, and I myself was one of them, there are many ways to make money. There are many ways to make a lot more money than to go work in Silicon Valley and start a company. The reason so many nerds go to Silicon Valley is because fundamentally we are believers in this mythology, the myth of the Valley, which is any problem in the universe can be solved by a really smart person with a keyboard and a soldering iron. That if you want to make the world a better place and really make a dent in the universe, the way Steve Jobs talked about it, you go and join Silicon Valley. This is how you do it. It's not about becoming a politician. It's not about starting a movement. It's about technology. That's our mythology. This is the story that year after year gets our country's best and brightest to go out there and join these tech giants and do their own startups and try to do what they do. And of course, you know, the reality is they were hired to actually figure out a way to sell 1/10 of 1/100th of 1% more ads to you and get you to watch more ads. That somehow is the culmination of your dreams of changing the world. That's ultimately what you're actually hired to do. The fact that we have accepted this and that so many of us actually ended up living that life and believing that lie is the great, you know, it's a great technology heist. It's somehow able to get so many people, so many smart people to believe in the story and to live a different story. And so my thesis really is about, okay, how can we rediscover the values we really care about? What are the values we really care about as human beings? You know, these are things like being social, seeing our friends every day, being playful, living in an environment in which we have control over the environment that we live in, that we don't live in an existence where we go from point to point inside a hermetically sealed car, that we can walk about to the places we want to be. We see the people we love every day, that we're near green things, that we acknowledge our reality as biological beings and feel connected to nature. These are the values we actually care about, because these are the values we again and again emphasize in stories we tell our children. And yet we don't live lives like that at all. And we sort of believe this new mythology of scalability and efficiency. We're told again and again that that kind of life is not possible, because the only way to sustain ourselves is to scale up to grow, right? You talk about startups, the only thing they care about, the only metric that they optimize for is growth. That is the only thing that matters to them. Nothing else matters. We pretend that all of this is inevitable, but I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it's true. Like, you know, we don't go out there intending to optimize ourselves into anonymous components in this techno org-like existence. That's not what we do. So as long as we keep on telling ourselves the story of technology being inevitably tending towards scalability, growth, hyper growth, and totalitarian growth, then we're never going to get out of it. We're always going to think all of these problems are inevitable, that there's no solution to misinformation spreading virally, that there's no solution to monopolies, that there's no answer to any of it, because it's all about growth. Growth is the only thing that can answer everything. And I don't believe that story. I think that's a myth. And until we can get outside of that story, we will never be able to really see another possibility, and that matters. So in that way, stories do matter. We need another story, and that's part of what's so exciting about Attack Surface and stories like it, because they try to tell a different story about what technology can be about and what the future can be.
Yeah, that's very beautifully said. You know, I for me, the one of the questions I was trying to answer with Attack Surface is, what does it mean to be a technologist whose entree into the field was almost certainly the discovery of the enormous self-determination that technology can give you, whether that's, you know, writing some code and having it execute perfectly and then being able to give that to someone else and they can execute it perfectly without you needing to be there. You project your will around the world, or just hopping on a network and finding people who are like you, who can say the things that you've never been able to articulate, but then to end up working for a firm whose sole purpose is taking away that self-determination from other people. And it feels like, you know, there's this funny thing about science fiction, which is that its golden age has almost no class consciousness or labor organizing in it, even though it was at the peak of American labor organizing. And we did a panel about this in San Jose at the Worldcon a couple of years ago. And Eric Flint said, well, yeah, because it was written for and by tech workers, engineers, who were in such short supply that they didn't need labor or class solidarity to advance, right? If your boss was a dick, you just told him to shove it and you walked across the street and someone gave you a better job. And so there was just never this sense of a collective enterprise. Today, within the tech worker world, with 20,000 Googlers walking off the job last year, and the tech won't build it movement, and tech solidarity, and workers refusing to build social or facial surveillance or tools for ICE or drones, it feels like we're at this moment where people who dreamt of having startups and ended up working for monopolists, where the second prize to making a dent in the universe is like free kombucha and massages on Wednesdays, are saying, maybe, you know, maybe technology can be used for something other than not just ads, but, you know, any of the shoddy grifts of lock-in and manipulation and control and surveillance. So I wanted to bring this to science fiction for a moment here. One of the things about putting technology in science fiction is it is necessarily going to involve some exposition. And as a kind of prose matter, do you have a way that you think about technological exposition when you write that makes it engage with the reader rather than boring them or turning them off? Either of you?
Well, I'll go first. I mean, I'll be honest, I actually really enjoy well-written info dumps. I really enjoy well-written exposition because I think they can serve to tell you the story of technology, you know, as I was saying, because I think there's nothing more exciting than stories about people passionately devoted to solving some problem and figuring out how to do it. That's a fundamental human quality, this playfulness, this idea that we can take things we already know, play with it, and put the components together in a different way to solve a new problem that we didn't know how to solve before. That's exciting. So, you know, when your technical exposition is about how do people figure out how to solve this problem? Why are people interested in this problem? You can't help but just get behind it. I mean, maybe it has to do with the fact that, my background is as an engineer, but I love passages where you're describing people being competent and solving problems and trying to figure out how to make it work. It's almost a fantasy in this day and age when all around you is incompetence, but it's lovely to see that.
I am also a huge fan of info dumps. I was really glad to hear you say that, Ken. I mean, and it is a perennial problem for me because I think that there's, info dumps are a very delicate thing. You have to have them if you're writing, especially something that is, set in a world with technologies that we don't really have in our world. So you can't assume your reader is going to be able to just follow you easily down that path. And so I love to have rich sort of description passages that deal with technology, but I often try to make the functioning of technology feel more vital to readers by actually having characters who are pieces of technology. So in my novel Autonomous, I have a character who is a robot, and we see into her consciousness a lot, and he's struggling, and I'm switching pronouns because the robot doesn't know what his or her pronoun is really, and is kind of struggling with that question. It's kind of a UX question for the robot. But we see all of the programs that people have put inside this robot's head in order to limit the kinds of things that he's allowed to think. And I deliberately named a lot of these programs to sound a little bit like Unix utilities, and to kind of remind the reader that, the way we design technology is something that we do to ourselves. We contain what we're able to do by limiting tech, or by making tech kind of unlimited in certain ways. Like we were talking earlier about kind of this obsession with scalability and just more and more speech, for example, on social media. That's the goal, just tons and tons of speech. It turns out maybe having an unlimited amount of speech might actually be socially toxic, just like having an unlimited amount of carbon in the atmosphere might be. So I like to have a way that readers can kind of almost identify with the technology. And in the novel I'm working on right now, which is about terraforming, I have a character who can network with the environment, because the environment is just packed with sensors, biodegradable sensors, of course. And so she can kind of feel the environment around her. And I loved being able to put an ecosystem in her head. But still, it's still info dumping. There's still that moment of and now there are wires, and this is what the wires look like, and this is what the sensors look like. And so I think it's kind of, for me, it's partially character development, and storytelling that way, and then partially just kind of rich descriptions. And then of course there's nothing like having a war or a fight to show off your technology, right?
That's right.
Hey, we got volcano weapons, kids. Let me show you how that works. And also a lesson in plate tectonics.
Wow.
Annalee, sorry, go ahead, Ken.
One of the things that I think what your comment brought to mind is also the idea of reader empowerment. I think infodumps can be actually a way to empower the reader and to really get them into the story. One of the things I really enjoy doing with my books, and also when I see it in other people's books, is the idea that the author takes some time to teach the reader some very basic things about the technology, so that later on the reader can then work out for themselves the implications of combining things and doing things and making unanticipated sort of consequences, so that the reader feels like they are there solving the problem and working it out almost as you are telling them what the solution is. I think that's a beautiful Zen moment that sci-fi can really do, which is really awesome if you do the info dumping right early on.
Yeah, and I love that in your work, Cory, by the way. I think one of the things that is so interesting about the way you deal with technology is there's an element of what Ken was talking about, the sort of competence, which of course we all love, but then there's also people who are misusing the technology or not using it in the way that they're told to. And that to me is always the best kind of info dump, because it's oh, you think it's this, but actually we're using it for this other thing. And let me tell you how that works. And that's that again appeals to the reader. It empowers the reader to think about technology as something they can appropriate for themselves.
It's
And
a very
digital hacking.
Gibsonian move, you know,
Yeah.
the street finding its own use for things. So at last night's event on Cyberpunk and post-Cyberpunk, Bruce Sterling said that the thing about fiction about the climate that's different from Cyberpunk is all about people having agency in a world gone wrong. And climate fiction is often about figuring out what to do when you can't change the world, when you have no, especially individual agency. And you have to find big groups of people to embark on remediation programs. You look skeptical, Annalee.
I guess I don't, I'm always skeptical of like, well, this genre is about
Oh,
people
sure.
having agency and this genre is about people being fucked or whatever. You know, it's like they're both, I mean, there's plenty of people in classic cyberpunk who are of course deprived of their rights and have to band together with rogue AIs and other groups to make a difference. So
speaking of info dumps, I had a revelation last year. I was teaching at a writing program, and I had a student ask how I've been told not to put info dumps in and not to use said bookisms and all these other rules of writing, and yet I find them in fiction I enjoy, including some of your fiction. How do you do them right? And I had this realization. I flashed to, speaking of technology and science fiction, Mudge Zatko from Cult of the Dead Cow, who after CDC went to work for the NSA, making spy tools for the Tailored Access Operations Group. And he told me that they would get these phone calls saying like, we will have access to this embassy tomorrow night. And we need to find a device that's vulnerable and we need to infect it while we're there. And these are the 11 devices we know are there. Which one should we write malware for? Write us some malware for it. And what they would do is just buy copies of that device, those devices. They would dump the binaries from them, the software from them, and they would look for the traces of the libraries that they knew people made mistakes with. Without knowing a single thing about the programmers and whether they were good programmers or bad programmers. Instead, what they did was they assessed how hard is it to do this without screwing up. And they would make an ordered list from the easiest to screw up to the hardest to screw up, the one that had the most kind of varsity libraries to implement, the ones that had the least. And they would start with the ones that are easiest to screw up to find the mistakes. And I realized that when we say good fiction doesn't have info dumps or good fiction doesn't have said bookisms or whatever, what we actually mean is it's really easy to screw those up. And so if your fiction isn't good, check to see if you've done one of those, because that's probably where you screwed it up. It was such a liberating revelation for me. So on the subject of tech and stories in the world, one of the groups of people who tell stories about technology that have a lot of consequence is lawyers and lawmakers. And given that both of you have this background in law, tech, and policy, I wanted to ask why you think lawmakers get it wrong. And I want to head off the easy explanation that they're old and stupid, because microbiology is hard to get right, and we're not all dead of giardia. And there are no microbiologists in Congress, and there's no microbiologists working for your, in your city council, and yet somehow they manage to get the pipes that come into your house right. So what is it about computers that makes them so uniquely hard to get the law's head around?
Well, I don't know if it's so much computers per se as more of a mismatch between worldviews. I mean, the way I approach it is to think about why is it that smart contracts have never been successful and probably never will be successful, because you talk to folks who are really into smart contracts and they always say, well, traditional legal contract drafting is ludicrous. It's so inefficient. It's full of ambiguities. It's full of matters of interpretation. You never know if you actually have what you bargained for. Why not just specify exactly what it is you bargained for in an artificial language that has no ambiguity, and then just rely on the execution of your virtual machine? You will have exactly what you wanted. And there will never be any need to go to the courts. And the problem is, this way of thinking about negotiations and what the law is about is actually not how lawyers think about the world. The law gains its power precisely from ambiguities, from the fact that there are certain things that can never be properly agreed upon by two sides. And you just leave it within the realm of the quantum indeterminate phase, and we can all live with the fact that it's indeterminate. And the fact that there is a fallback position of litigating when things go wrong is what allows us to actually agree to do things that otherwise we would never agree to do. We take risks of things working out because we're perpetual optimists. We negotiate contracts and legislate and make the law work the way they do because we are perpetually thinking that we're going to get a little bit more than the worst case. And in that overlap is where we can have a bargain. And I think folks who are working with computers never accept the fuzziness and the fact that human beings are fundamentally only of limited rationality. And the only way we're able to live together the way we are is because we do trust a little bit of strategic ambiguity. We accept it. And I think that's a lot of why legal rules about computers is so confusing, because real life just isn't like that. It's very hard for lawyers to think about things related to machines in that way. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, the example that we were talking about just before the panel, applying copyright rules to computer code. That was an analogy that made a lot of sense to lawyers because, you know, you write things down. This is it looks like text. How is it not copyright? But copyright is about fuzzy things. It's about expression. It's not about ideas. It's about the way it feels rather than the way it works. But computer code is all about the way it works, not the way it feels. So applying copyright to what is otherwise fundamentally a machine, that just happens to be represented in text, was a mistake that we made from the beginning. But once, you know, there's a path dependency in legal technology the same way there is in any technology. Once the mistake has been made, it is very hard to fix. And we're always trying to fit copyright doctrine into what otherwise is not at all within the realm of copyright. So, you know, you go down that route and you're just gonna have to deal with it. We're gonna have to deal with the consequences of it.
How about you, Annalee? What do you think?
I mean, I agree with what Ken was saying, and I think that there is this fundamental problem around ambiguity versus this kind of fantasy of rationality that we have kind of projected onto technology. There's this myth that machines just can't have ambiguity. And of course that's true in some sense. If you're talking about compiling code, you know, you can't have a sentence in your code or a phrase that's ambiguous, or your compiler will scream at you. But I think that clash, the clash that between ambiguity and rationality comes up in a lot of places. It's not just in lawmaking. I think in lawmaking, we see lots of failure modes that then spill over into things like, I keep thinking about social media, maybe because of the times that we're in, where you've seen these projects, things like Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, or name your favorite social network.
Friendster,
sure.
Oh, wow.
Or Orkut, you know, let's just go all the way back to Orkut. Still thriving, or LiveJournal. And these were all efforts to use software in a way that seemed kind of a way of rationalizing social connection, right? Like if we could just figure out the right way to code these social spaces, we would facilitate friendship, we would facilitate what an old boss of mine always called the conversation. You know, we would have these magical conversations where like Cory would be saying something and then suddenly Elon Musk would drop in and say something witty, and then like, you know, a politician would come in and add her point of view, and then we would all arrive at some truth, right?
Annalee, you're talking about Clubhouse. You're talking about Clubhouse.
I know. Hey man, you got an invite? So we keep having this fantasy, and we keep seeing that when you try to apply these notions of rationality, these ideas that we can build something in code that will translate perfectly into a social context, whether that social context is a contract or just a hangout, it just doesn't work because we're not accounting for that ambiguity. And I think, honestly, like one of the biggest problems with Facebook is that the people who were building it didn't ever think, oh, we need to focus on how ambiguity works, and how actually, if you just allow people to share a bunch of crap, that might not be the best way to do social. That's not the best way to do communication, shall we say, or socializing. So I think I'm always kind of coming back to that problem of like, not so much that code is rational and humans are, and sort of human relationships are ambiguous, but that there is this ambiguity all over the place, but we don't acknowledge it as much in the world of technology. And I mean, ultimately, like when law fails with technology, it's sometimes also failing to acknowledge the ambiguity of code and of technologies. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, to get back to your book, Cory, in Attack Surface, I felt like the thing I really wanted to hear you talk a little bit about was how Masha, like a lot of real life hackers that we know, is playing both sides, and how that creates this vulnerability for her. And I feel like this is just something that it just keeps coming up in a more and more urgent way in everyday life, where people are being, kind of tempted into doing things that are unethical because there's this excitement of the code that you might get to see, or the access you might get to have, and how people navigate that. Like I just want to hear you talk about sort of how you were building that character, and like what you were, and how you sort of felt like it was related to the real world, or how she was related to the world.
Thank you, Annalee. Yeah, when the book opens, Masha, her day job is helping dictators install software in their data centers to spy on pro-democracy activists. And her hobby is teaching pro-democracy activists how to resist the surveillance appliances that she installs all day. So it's obviously not a very sustainable career move, and eventually very quickly, it precipitates the beginning of the story and gets her moving. And I think you're right. People do straddle that line. And I always go back to one of the things about Little Brother is that it made these three bets, right? The first was that like computer science would remain computer science, that we weren't going to magically invent cryptography that worked except when bad guys used it, right? And second, that computers would continue to become more salient to our lives, and third, that we would fail to come to grips with that our policy and our lawmaking would continue to not appreciate the dangers of weaponizing technology that you also rely on. And, here we are, right, with NSA super weapons having been leaked by dum-dums, turned into ransomware and being used to take over hospitals and kill people, right? Like those bets paid off really well, unfortunately. And, when Little Brother came out and did well, it started to attract a lot of attention from people who work in these spaces. One of the places that I ended up going to speak about the book was West Point for the Cyber Institute. And I got up and I talked about the urgency of making computers secure and not leaving them tactically insecure so that we can catch bad guys, and how risky that is. And afterwards, I signed all the cadets' books, and one of them hung back till the very end of the signing. He came up and he said, I just want you to know I'm going to go work for the NSA. And I said, okay, tell me why. And he said, well, all the stuff you said about the computerized world we live in, where we have computers in our bodies like pacemakers and implanted defibrillators and artificial pancreases and so on. We put our bodies in computers, our buildings are computers, our cars are computers, and we trust them with our lives. Our data, our finances, everything is mediated by computers. And my family doesn't know how to make any of this stuff work. And they're just sitting ducks. Someone's got to defend them. So I'm going to work for the NSA, because if no one is on the side of the right, who's going to fix this stuff? And he was clearly very sincere. And what I told him at the time was like, you need to hear Ed Snowden's story. He hadn't published his memoir yet, but he had, I think it was a big profile in Vanity Fair that didn't include any classified stuff, because one of the weird things about having clearance is you're not allowed to read any of the articles about Snowden's revelations, because he's revealing you're mishandling classified information. So you can't read the front page of the New York Times if you've got clearance. But I said, you can go read this Vanity Fair article, because he was gung-ho, right? He wanted to do what you wanted to do. He was full of the kind of atavistic rage that motivates Masha when she goes to work for the Department of Homeland Security after a terrorist attack. He wanted to keep the people he loved safe. He discovered that the mission was running counter to why he joined. He thought that it was illegal. He brought his case to everyone he could find up through the chain of command. He was brilliant. He worked hard at it. Eventually, he decided that he would risk a firing squad because there was no hope of getting anyone inside the system to fix it. And if you go into that system without a plan that doesn't account for what Snowden went through, then the best you can hope for is to go through what Snowden went through. And I see it all over the place. Technologists who, and not just technologists, cyber lawyers, other people who are like adjacent to the field, who want security in an increasingly insecure world, who understand that we've arrived at a world of kind of feudal security where there are bandits out there, and you find a warlord like Apple or Facebook or whatever, and they'll put you in their walled garden, and then they'll keep you safe from everyone except them. And they kid themselves for a while that the warlord's got everyone's best interests at heart, and then they realize one day that the warlord actually doesn't really care about the people trapped inside the fortress, and they start to wonder what they're going to do about all those bandits. And so that was the story I wanted Masha to live through and ask herself.
Yeah, she felt very Snowden-y to me. Yeah, that's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're at the like Q2 mark. We have one question here in the chat from Anastasia, and I hope we'll get some more from others. Otherwise, I have plenty more to talk to you two about. Anastasia asks Annalee about whether all technologies and not just vaccines are social technologies, and whether there isn't some reductio ad absurdum in which everything is social. I'm reminded of Clay Shirky calling the kitchen table the first piece of social media.
That's nice. I mean, humans are social animals. And sure, you can go live by yourself and, you know, kind of go off the grid. And I know people who've done that, and it is an option. So not everything has to be social. But I do think that especially as storytellers, whether we're telling true stories or making stories up, the way that we have to think about technology is always in its social context. There's just no way to pull it out of that. And I'm sure that there are writers who have tried to do that, and props to them. That's not the kind of writer I am. And that those are not, I don't actually know how you would have a technology that wasn't social, but I'm sure that there are counterexamples. I just think that when we imagine technologies going out into the world and being used, we always have to think about what the social context is for their use. You know, are they going to be, I mean, this is exactly what Cory's been talking about with the character of Masha, which is, you know, she's working with technologies that are really similar in two very different contexts, and they will have very different, the world will experience very different outcomes depending on where those technologies are deployed and who's controlling them. So I guess tentatively, yes, all technology is social. And, you know, with the caveat that I am sure you can find me a perfect example of like some piece of technology that's never been deployed in the real world and that lives in someone's back pocket. And that person is super antisocial and like, you know, they're not on the Zoom call, so we can't talk to them.
Ken, did you have any thoughts on the intrinsic sociability of technology?
I did. I was struck by what the two of you were saying about this fundamental way in which we're always being hacked or you know, socially hacked really into doing the things that we actually wouldn't want to do if we were aware of all the information. I mean, one of the issues that you're talking about this dilemma that we all have of, you know, siding with the warlord in order to feel secure is we're being hacked, right? We have this deep desire for security. We want to be on the right side of history. We want to protect our loved ones, and so we say, well, there are bad people doing these bad things, and we have to get them under control. And so we're hacked into developing technologies and supporting the growth of centralization of power until we see someday that that centralization of power will take away the very thing we were supposedly protecting in the first place. This is sort of the devil's bargain we're always forced to make. You know, many of us do not wish to see a world in which the US is absolutely predominant and 100% the most powerful nation in the world. But we're forced into supporting that position because we think any alternative is worse. But that kind of thinking out of fear, it will always end up with a greater monster than the one you set out to slay. So I just don't think that's a good way to do it. But, you know, in the moment, you know, that atavistic fear reaction that we have, we just give up. We say, okay, let's do it. Let's support the war. Let's go with it.
I think that's very well put. And I'm reminded of how over and over again for a century, the DOJ tried to break up AT&T for being just the most horrible bullying company you can imagine. And like in the 50s, they were given a reprieve because just as they were about to be broken up, the Pentagon said, no, we can't fight wars in Korea without AT&T. And then in like 1982, they were almost given another reprieve 30 years later because people said, Japan is going to destroy America's electronics industry. We need our national champion, AT&T, don't break them up. It turned out that like AT&T's major monopolistic project was suppressing modems. And breaking up AT&T was not bad for American technological dominance. As a result, it turned out that the modem was pretty good for the American century. So we got a great question here from Madonna Yoder, who asks a really good question. I work as a robotics engineer for a living with a heavy interest in swarm robotics. Do you have any advice on how I can avoid Terminator or Black Mirror from happening in real life? This is an awesome, awesome question. Oh my goodness. Annalee, I'm going to start with you because you're the robot writer.
That's right.
Oh, man. So, well, I mean, this is, again, going back to one of those comments that we were discussing earlier about like how, you know, certain problems require a social solution or require, you know, large scale mobilization. Like, unfortunately, it's not something you can do all by yourself. You can't like write the, you know, your personal laws of robotics and then have them propagate throughout all robot kind. And also I would advise against that because just as we've been describing the limitations of the law in governing technology, a 3 laws of robotics or however many laws of robotics, 10 laws as they have in Japan, that approach is a one-size-fits-all approach that will never work for propagating ethics in your robots, right? So you're never gonna, you have swarm robots, so you know that there's all kinds of ways to have robots and that robots are not all the same. But I would say one of the things that I've been really impressed with in folks who are working in biotech and synthetic biology is that so there's this annual contest for students called iGEM. Look it up after you look up the kitty, the acoustic kitty.
Acoustic kitty.
Yeah, so iGEM, it's IGEM. And it's for students to invent synthetic biology products, whatever those might be. Self-healing cement was one of the early ones that I thought was quite impressive. And every project has to include a section on safety and how, if the product malfunctions, it will be, you'll be able to quickly turn it off or remove it, or, you know, whatever the context is in which it's been deployed. And I think that's step one, right? Is that anytime you're developing a technology, you have to be thinking about safety. And with, you know, computers, one of the things that security experts love to say with this kind of yearning sadness on their face is like, can't you build security into it from the beginning instead of like building a thing and then hammering security into the top at the end and hoping that it works? So I think that's the other piece, is to be from the outset having those concerns at the fore, whether those are security concerns, privacy concerns, you know, concerns around just basic safety. So, you know, it's an after school special kind of message that I have for you, you know, always be thinking about safety.
How about you, Ken?
I totally agree. Annalee is, you know, what you've just said. I also think there's another component to it in which you have to be aware that the folks inventing the technology will never be the ones who will foresee every possible application of it. Tim Berners-Lee could not possibly have foreseen that TikTok would become the great application on that network. It's just not possible. You can't see it.
Right.
So one of the things you kind of have to do is perhaps to think about the way in which you build up society's own immune system to abuses of technology. So I'm a big believer in this also after school special way of thinking about things, which is empowerment. The more we can demystify and remove proprietary protections and black boxes from technology, the more we have the ability to slay the monster when we need to. If we're supposedly trusting black box algorithms to determine who is safe to be let out of prison, who should be allowed to get a loan, who should be allowed to enter the country or receive an asylum application approval, then we are step by step going into a dystopia of our own making. We need to ensure that transparency, openness, understanding by the user is always there, a fundamental part of technology application and deployment. We have to allow users to understand what it is that's being determined on their behalf. Without it, I just don't think we'll ever be able to get over the information asymmetry.
I'm going to shoot. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Annalee.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I mean, as a science fiction writer, if I'm thinking about a utopian solution, I would love to see tech development have a phase that's like sort of like a beyond a QA phase where users are brought in as representatives. And I know some companies try to do this, but like just to see like how does an average user interact with this robot and like what do they do, and maybe have a period of like, take this robot home for 3 months. We're just going to pay attention to what you do with it, what your dog does to it, what your baby does to it, how it spies on your neighbors, and kind of have that be part of the safety routine. I would love that. I volunteer to like take your robots home.
Reminds me of IDEO's approach, actually. I was going to say I'm going to shoot for a much lower bar. I'm gonna try and figure out what Madonna can do so that on her deathbed, she doesn't think, well, I could have done more to prevent the apocalypse that we're living through. So that's, I don't think she can prevent the apocalypse, but I think that she can shoot for not actively contributing to it. And I think that comes in two forms. The first is to recognize that you have a high demand skill, which means that you have an enormous amount of agency in your workplace that many of us don't have. And you can quit. You can say no. You can refuse, right? You can do what Oppenheimer should have done before he started quoting the Bhagavad Gita and just not build the bomb, which is an even better thing to do than regretting building the bomb. And then the other thing to do is to bind yourself to Ulysses Pacts. So Ulysses was a hacker and he wanted to be able to hear the sirens, and the protocol for sailing through the Siren Sea was to fill your ears with wax so you couldn't hear them. And he hacked around it. He asked his sailors to lash him to the mast, but leave his ears unstoppered. What he knew was that there would be a time in the future where he would be weak. And he knew that right now he was strong. And so he asked the people around him to bind him in his moment of strength against his moment of weakness. We all do this all the time. You throw away the Oreos the night you go on a diet, right? In software, we apply irrevocable free and open source licenses to our code. So even if your boss later says, you know what, if you don't make this code proprietary, I'm firing everyone, all those people from high school you convinced to leave their cushy jobs and work for you, you're gonna, they're not gonna be able to get their kids' teeth fixed or collect their pensions. You can just say, I that's terrible and I feel awful about it, but I literally cannot revoke this license. Find ways to bind yourself now while you are worried about this. Tell your friends, make a public pledge, do whatever it takes to add some friction on the slippery slope that we are all standing on the top of and all prone to slide down. Now, Tom, I see you're back in the video. I wonder if we can have 1 minute to answer Aspen's final question, and then we'll close it up. So this is a lightning round. Aspen asks about how all technologies are so interrelated in the world and there are so many knock-on effects. How do you tell a story about technological change where all of the changes and the knock-on effects of the causality don't swamp the narrative?
Okay. You have to pick a pathway through the knock-on effects, right? You're never going to be able to have, like, unless you become the techno Dickens and you write, even if you were to write 3,000, pages, you would never be able to capture all of it. So I think, yeah, you have to follow your characters through, follow one series of dominoes falling and see where it takes you.
Ken, how about you?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't think your job is to predict every possible implication of the change you're proposing. You're trying to tell a story and focus on one very human level change. And that's what I tried to do. I tried to tell one very human, personal, specific story, and leave it to the reader to imagine the other possibilities.
And I was going to say that, to the extent that these stories are thought experiments, that they act like other models in which they are inaccurate in useful ways. The doctor who swabs your throat and then puts it in a petri dish and checks what's growing there 3 days later does not have an accurate model of your body. She has a very usefully inaccurate model of your body in which only one fact, right, whatever gunk was at the back of your throat, has become salient. And from that, she can tell you a lot about you, not by being comprehensive and accurate, but by being not comprehensive, right? That's where the insight comes from. And a science fiction writer can reach into the world and pluck out one technology and build a world in a bottle around it and give you a 360-degree turn around it by having the characters circle it for their own reasons. And that can give you some emotional fly-through of what some technological circumstance might feel like that is not accurate, but it is true. And that's kind of what I try to do with a lot of the fiction that I work on. And now I give us back to Tom and our host there in Dallas, Texas, Tom at Interabang.
Folks, thank you all so much for joining us. Cory, it's been fantastic. Annalee, Ken, you guys were incredible. I've really enjoyed this conversation myself, and I'm so happy we're all able to get together this evening to discuss tech and sci-fi. Really some great thoughts I'm going to continue thinking about. I should note that everybody who is on this call has already bought a copy of Attack Surface, but you should buy more. You should buy many, many more copies of this. Give them to your friends. The holiday season's coming up, and goodness knows it's a phenomenal book that you'll love and you'll have a chance to pass on to others and recommend, frankly. We've got more copies at the bookstore. You can find them online at interabangbooks.com. The Eventbrite, the link that you use to buy the ticket for this, I've got links there that you can connect with me. You can come into the store physically and buy your hardcover copy. I should also mention that our in-conversation guests have been kind enough to send me book plates of their own signature. So if you've got one of Ken's books that you want to buy from me, it's precious, I love it. If you've got one of Annalee's book that you'd like to buy from me, do so. I can get you a signed copy. It'll be fun times. Yes. The future of another timeline.
Here, I'll do mine.
Thomas, look at it.
I have Ken's book, but it's really high up on my shelf. My fantasy stuff is like really high.
Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. It's been a wonderful time. Again, Cory, please, final thoughts, sir.
Yeah, I just want to say in closing, thank you again to Annalee and Ken. And also there's 2 more nights of this. So tomorrow night, I'll be at Skylight Books with Tochi Onyebuchi and Bethany C. Morrow for a panel called Little Revolutions, talking about how you write radical fiction for kids. And then we finish it off with Window Snyder from Loft Heavy Industries and Apple and Google, a great cryptographer and security researcher, and Runa Sandvig from the Tor Project, who also used to secure the New York Times newsroom, on practical operational security, making yourself secure, making the people you love secure. Both of those also come with copies of the book, which, despite Tom's imprecations, I have my doubts about the usefulness of to you if you already own one copy, but I have a solution, which is that if you go to craphound.com and scroll down a bit, you will find a list of libraries, schools, prisons, halfway houses, universities, and other institutions that are seeking copies. And so you can give their address instead of yours when you buy your ticket, and they will get your second or third copy if you want to come to these other events.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a lovely evening,
Thanks
folks.
everyone who attended too. Good night.